Something about flowers. A Persuading Miss Mary inspired story vignette written by Leenie Brown and narrated by Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the Elevenlabs library. Author's note: when I was writing Persuading Miss Mary, Book 4 in my Marrying Elizabeth series, I wanted to write something for the young woman who was Lord Westonbury's mistress. I thought it was only fair that she got a second chance at a proper happily ever after if he did. This vignette holds a promise of giving her just that, a happily ever after. The sun shone brilliantly upon the green meadow while the wind whispered across it, ruffling the blades of tall grass. The daisies that grew along the edge of the meadow, where it joined a small wooded lot, called to Hannah, and since the vase on the table in her new home was empty, she listened. One flower joined another as she plucked them with one hand and gathered them into a bouquet in the other. "Good day, madame." The greeting startled Hannah. She had heard footsteps, of course, but she had not thought to be addressed. This was a meadow which many crossed on a lovely summer day such as today. Just 10 minutes ago she'd seen two young lads chasing each other along the footpath next to it. "Good day, sir," she curtsied as she greeted the gentleman who had stopped to talk to her. He was tall and not altogether slender. There was a stockiness to his features and a softness that rounded his cheeks, and yet, despite that and the touch of grey in his hair and beard, he was quite handsome. She had once known someone who was handsome in a similar fashion, though he had been less stocky and without a fleck of grey in his hair. "That is a lovely bunch of flowers you have there. Are they for your table or someone else's?" "They're for my table." She looked at the happy little flowers in her hand for just a moment before adding, "Unless, of course, you are in need of some cheer." She held the small bouquet out to him. There were enough flowers here to gather this bunch for him, and another for herself. He chuckled. "That is kind of you, ma'am, but I was just looking for some way to speak to you. Truth be told, I have very little care for one flower over another." Her eyes grew wide, and she blinked as her heart picked up its pace. "No, it couldn't be. I know it is a most shocking revelation," he continued in a friendly fashion. "In fact, I'm probably the only gent in all of England proper who thinks in such a way." She studied his face carefully. His smile was familiar. "I am sure there must be at least one other gentleman who cares so little for flowers," she said. "Indeed, I would guess there are likely a great number who only pretend to care for them to impress their ladies." "I used to have a friend," he said, "who would say that very thing when I would declare her flowers were pretty, but nothing that stirred my emotions as they did hers." Sadness touched his eyes. "Do you miss her?" "Most grievously." Hannah stooped and plucked another flower. "I hope your parting was not because some ill befell her." "It was her father's doing," he said as he stood looking back across the meadow toward the small village that was now her home. "I would like to ask how so," Hannah said, "but that would be prying into things which are not my business." He shrugged. "The man was a bore, and I do not mean dull. He meant to see her married well, as he defined it, with no consideration for her opinion, and so she fled into the night." He glanced at her. "I cannot blame her. I only wish I knew whether she was well and happy." Hannah snapped her mouth closed. It was him, but he had not had a beard the last time she had seen him. He chuckled. "I agree. It is a rather maudlin bit of rambling for a fellow who does not like flowers." She drew in a deliberate breath as she prepared to reveal herself to her old friend. "A gentleman who possesses a caring heart must express it in some fashion, and if he does not favour flowers, then perhaps he prefers words." His eyes focused on her intently as she spoke. "Perhaps," she continued, "even poetry?" His head tipped and his brow furrowed. "My friend used to say something similar." "Oh, she most certainly knew that." "If that is the case," Hannah said, "then I would suspect that she's a very wise young woman, and being wise, I would venture to guess that she's quite well and happy." She looked away from his kind and inquisitive eyes to the flowers in her hand. "However, I also suspect she would rather not be found even by a dear friend if she were trying to avoid her father." His lips tipped into a crooked smile. "I suppose you're correct about that." He removed his hat. "Allow me to introduce myself. I am Mr. Andrew Cameron, and I suspect you are the woman who has purchased the cottage down the lane." "I am." "And what name do you go by?" he asked. The meaning of his question was not lost on her when it was paired with his knowing expression. "My new friends and neighbours call me Mrs. James." "You married?" The startled question was soft. Hannah shook her head. "But Mrs. James is more respectable than Miss James," she said softly. "And are you happy?" She shrugged. "I am, I suppose. My friend always talked about baking cakes and pouring tea in our village some day. Of course, when she spoke of it, it was not my village. It was our secret." He placed his hat back on his head and offered her his arm. "I never married either. I've been teaching. I once had a friend who loved to give instruction on all sorts of dreadfully boring things." She placed her hand on his arm. "I would like to think he has become quite a successful tutor since I last saw him." He covered her hand with his for one brief but lovely moment. I dare say if he enjoyed the dreadfully boring things, he had no choice but to become a most excellent tutor. "I'm glad to hear it, for I would wish for nothing less for him," she said. "He was always my protector and most trusted confidant." And if her father had approved of him, he would have been her husband. "Perhaps," he said as they walked slowly down the trail and towards her home, "perhaps we can be new friends, just as we were old ones." "I would like that." My, how she would like that. "But I must warn you that I am not the girl I once was. Nor am I the boy you once knew." He shook his head. She drew a shaky breath. She wanted so badly to slip easily into an old friendship that had promised so much. But she had known when she began working at Sally's that she would likely never be able to marry a respectable gentleman like Andrew. "But I have done things," she whispered. Things that she thought she had had to do, but still things which were not acceptable for a proper young woman to have done. "Rendered services?" he asked in a soft and gentle tone. She nodded. Again, he covered her hand for a brief lovely moment. It is not just the master of the house who sometimes demands more than a contracted and honourable service from those in his employ. She turned wide eyes to him. They had often spoken about how she had found her father's proclivity for young maids to be appalling. Had the same sort of thing happened to him through the mother of some child he was hired to teach? He smiled. "I had to earn enough to set myself up on my own, just as you did." He sighed. "I moved here 6 months ago. I have a full roster of students to teach and no mothers to dodge any longer." "Oh, I am so sorry you were forced to do what you did not wish to do." She glanced out toward the open field. "I was not forced. I chose to do something I despised." He shook his head. "No, you were forced to choose what would pay best. I know that is why you would do such a thing." "You have always understood me so well," she cried. "How could I not?" he replied. "I still believe we are two halves of the same soul." "And I still say that is ridiculous," Hannah replied with a laugh. "Souls do not come in halves. I suppose I shall have to agree with you again, as I have always had to in the past." He exhaled as if finally coming to some very comfortable position in which he could find rest. It sounded a lot like what her heart wished to find. "I shall not condemn you," he said, "if you will not condemn me for doing what I felt I had to do to earn the money I needed." "I could never condemn you," she hurried to assure him. "Then we are agreed?" he asked. "Our pasts are behind us?" "Yes," she answered. "Mine is just an unpleasant road that had to be traversed to find my present." They had come to the gate at the back of her small garden. "When does your tea room open?" he asked. "I have not yet found a place to put it. I am just newly arrived in the area, as I am sure you know." He opened the gate for her. "Then allow me to call for you tomorrow morning and we will take a walk. I think I might just know of a place. The owner, I hear, is also new to the area. I think he's been here 6 months." Hannah gasped. "You did not buy it thinking of me, did you?" "I've done nothing without thinking of you." He tipped his hat. "Until tomorrow?" She handed him one of her daisies. "I will be eager to receive your call." He twirled the flower between his fingers and smiled. He said. "Perhaps there is something to like about flowers when they are given to you by the person you love." And then, with a touch to his hat, he was off, meandering back down the lane in the direction from which they had just come. Thank you for listening to Something About Flowers. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, please help other readers find it by liking this video and sharing it. And don't forget to subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you'll know when I upload another video. The 2023 copyright for Tales from Pemberley and other sweet story vignettes, in which Something About Flowers can be found, is held by Leenie Brown. All rights reserved. The narrator for this story has been Christopher, a cloned voice made available by the voice actor through the Elevenlabs library.